I'm Afshin Rattan. We're going underground on the day of arguably the most controversial Eurovision Song Contest final in history. Coming up in the show, former mayor of an occupied town in the West Bank, author of Trump and the Jews, David Rubin, on how Eurovision, promoted by both Madonna and the UK's BBC, politically validates Israel amidst the prospect of the most devastating war in Middle East history. And we ask whether Britain should have taken part at all. Now there is filmed proof of interference in UK politics by the Israeli embassy in London. Plus, not the Eurovision, hip-hop artist and activist Lowkey tells us why we should be boycotting tonight's final. All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground, but first to Eurovision. In a week when more than 22 children were shot by Israeli forces, someone who will be watching the Madonna and BBC-promoted competition is the former mayor of Shiloh in the contested West Bank. David Rubin joins me via noisy Skype link from New York. David, welcome to Going Underground. So what does having the Eurovision Song Contest in Tel Aviv mean to you?
Well, it's very, very important for the country. You know, Israel. There was controversy over this. Israel won the last Eurovision, and as you know, there's a tradition that the country that wins the Eurovision hosts the Eurovision in the following year. But of course, having it in Israel is a recognition that maybe the world is becoming a better place. And despite the objections of some of the anti-Semites, including people like Roger Waters and others, there is absolutely no reason why Israel should not be the host this year.
Obviously, Pink Floyd's frontman Roger Waters would deny that he is an anti-Semite. Absolutely. And for all of what you're saying, how happy you are, you know only too well about security issues. Presumably it'll have to be very tight. Just remind us the story that you've been telling recently of how militants nearly killed you and your 3-year-old son, spurring you to create the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund.
About 17 years ago, I was driving home from Jerusalem with my 3-year-old son sitting behind me in the baby seat, and suddenly we were halfway home. The car was hit by a massive hail of bullets from terrorists who were on the side of the road. These terrorists were from the Palestinian Authority. They were Fatah terrorists, and they were shooting with AK-47 assault rifles. I found out that my son had been shot in the head, that the bullet had gone into his head and through his neck, missing his brainstem by 1 millimeter. When there is a conflict, Israel aims at military institutions.
So you're saying Israel does not...
Missile launching pads.
You're saying Israel doesn't target children?
Absolutely not. God forbid. But sometimes in the fighting, there are innocents that are hurt. And that's the reality of war.
Okay, I mean, obviously the United Nations disagrees with you completely, and the most recent report said that in the Great March of Return, obviously, IDF were responsible for deliberately targeting children. The Eurovision Song Contest is on, and it wasn't long ago that no less than the Wall Street Journal, the Murdoch Wall Street Journal, reported that Netanyahu, the Israeli government, were facilitating medical treatment for militants linked to al-Qaeda, the people responsible for 9/11, which happened in the town you're in right now.
Israel is a humane country. It is true that Israel has treated people who have fled the fighting in Syria and who have needed medical care. We don't apologize for that. We're actually very proud of it, that we are a humane country.
On this topic of Trump and the Jews, and you have to forgive me because I haven't read the book. I will take a look at the book. You mentioned Shiloh. You were the mayor of that. Now you know, of course, that place that you were mayor of used to have names Turmasaya and Karyut. When you were mayor there, were you in violation of a UN resolution because you were in an occupied settlement?
First of all, let me state very clearly, I have lived there for 27 years. It's not occupied in any way.
It's in the occupied West Bank.
Before there was Jerusalem, there was Shiloh about 3,300 years ago. So these Arab villages that have sprouted out in recent decades, just in the past 50 years or so, those are not indigenous villages.
I mean, these villages have obviously been there a while. I think what I'm getting at is, when you were mayor, were you personally violating international law? because they're in an illegal settlement. Resolution 2334, unopposed at the UN Security Council, 14-0, said that settlement building was in flagrant violation of international law. I mean, did you violate law?
Settlement building by whom?
By the Israeli government, is what is specified in the resolution.
First of all, I was the mayor of Shiloh, and the people who live there have built homes and have purchased homes on their own free will, just as the Arab residents in Samaria have purchased homes of their own free will.
David Rubin, thank you. Well, the UN accused Israel of possible war crimes after they shot more than 6,000 unarmed Palestinians during the Great March of Return. And that's something you probably won't hear from Madonna or Graham Norton on the BBC today. For more on how important Eurovision is to Israel, I'm joined from Manchester by Rafi Bloom, co-chair of Northwest Friends of Israel. Rafi, welcome back to Going Underground. So we just heard from a former Israeli mayor. He said Eurovision is a sign that in Israel is a sign of a world becoming a better place, a kind of validation of a modern country. You think that's true too, I suppose?
I think it's absolutely fantastic that the Eurovision is being held in Israel. I think it's a fantastic opportunity for the tens of thousands of visitors who will be coming to Israel, for the hundreds of millions of more worldwide who will be watching it, to see that Israel is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. It's the only country in the Middle East where you can practice any religion freely, where you're not persecuted for your sexuality. It's the startup nation. It's a welcoming nation living in a very, very tough neighborhood.
No one would doubt the LGBTQ rights are better in Israel than in Gaza or in the West Bank, perhaps. But you can't say it's a democracy, surely, with only 1 in 7 Palestinians under Israeli direct control able to vote in the recent elections?
Well, actually, Israel just recently held elections where all citizens, be they Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Druze, Circassian, were able to vote. And let's be very clear about
this. No,
this.
they weren't. They weren't able to vote, were they? 1 in 7 had the right to vote, was the calculation.
1 second. If you ask about Israeli citizens, every Israeli citizen over the age of 18 has the right to vote. If you are referring to Palestinians who live in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, let's be very clear about this. They have the right to vote in Palestinian elections.
People like Roger Waters, Wolf Alice, and they want everyone to boycott the Eurovision Song Contest. You really think that they're motivated by anti-Semitism and not a support for international law?
I think the BDS movement, of whom those people that you just mentioned are vocal supporters, is an anti-Semitic movement. I mean, Omar Barghouti, the founder of the BDS movement, has gone on record as saying that he will never countenance, and the Palestinians will never countenance, anything other than a Palestinian state between the river and the sea. Now, that means the end of the Jewish state of Israel. That is anti-Semitic.
Yeah, but Roger Waters, I mean, he was on the show just the other week, this show. I mean, you don't think he's an anti-Semite, surely? I mean, the former mayor Shiloh just said he was. I said he would deny it, obviously.
Of course, Roger Waters is very disingenuous. Are many of the BDS movement? Why do you think that we hear constantly at BDS rallies and marches, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? That means from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, i.e. no Israel. So absolutely.
Well, technically, it could mean within the 1967 borders, because it'd be Gaza and the West Bank joined up. I mean, surely, only in the past few weeks, the UN has accused Israel of possible war crimes. The UN saying there are reasonable grounds to say Israeli soldiers targeted, shot at children, medics, journalists. So how can a Eurovision Song Contest be under the auspices of a country that does that?
If you're referring to the UN report, which from the UN Human Rights Council, which we know is blatantly biased, and we know that a lot of Western countries have voted against it or abstained, let's look at this great return march, so to speak. We saw a BBC documentary only a couple of nights ago in the UK that clearly showed and quoted Palestinian demonstrators saying that there were Hamas terrorists in their midst with rifles and AK-47s and pistols attacking Israeli positions. We saw Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas, saying we're going to tear the border down and rip out the hearts of Israelis. Israel has the right, as any sovereign nation does, to defend its borders and its civilians within those borders. So following that...
Well, you're talking about the BBC, and of course the BBC, they say that they want to cover Eurovision and say it's not political. nothing to do with the kind of validation of Israel. You'd go with the BBC version of that rather than the United Nations that says Israeli soldiers gunned down 6,000 unarmed protesters.
Well, first of all, if you watch the BBC documentary, you can see that many of them were not unarmed. You can see that Hamas cynically used the Palestinian civilians as human shields. And, you know, you've got other guests coming on the show like Lowkey. I mean, by actually excusing the acts of Hamas of using its own Palestinian population as cover for its terrorist activities, by not calling them out and criticizing them, people like Lowkey or Roger Waters or people like that are actually harming the people, the ordinary Palestinians they profess to care for. The UEFA Cup final in a couple of weeks' time is being held in Azerbaijan. Terrible human rights record. These people are not calling for a boycott of that.
That's also a point taken, but of course, but you can't. No country in the world is in violation of more United Nations resolutions than Israel. And
doesn't that just go to show you how biased the United Nations is? That they've
the United Nations is the world. You can't be biased at the United Nations, can you?
Well, one second. You can, because look at this from a statistical point of view. The United Nations has passed more resolutions in the past year against Israel than it has against Syria, who are bombing its civilians, and you know this as well as I do, with chemical weapons.
Well, the Syrian government continue to deny any use of chemical weapons. And I asked the former mayor of Shiloh, why is it Israel was helping the rebels in Syria, like Britain, of course, supported some of those rebels? Why was it treating al-Qaeda and ISIS-Daesh forces? Is Israel now on the same side as Saudi Arabia, ISIS-Daesh, al-Qaeda, and Hamas, a group which, of course, Israel funded the creation of?
I think that there's never been any proof that Israel has funded or helped ISIS or Daesh or al-Qaeda.
We saw Netanyahu on the Golan Heights visiting the hospital in the occupied Golan Heights, and they were treating al-Qaeda and ISIS.
What you saw him visiting and treating was it's Syrian civilians caught up in this brutal civil war.
No, it was the al-Nusra Front, wasn't it?
I've seen is Israeli field hospitals treating Syrian women and children fleeing, caught up in this brutal civil war. And so Israel is absolutely not in bed with ISIS or Daesh. That is, it's conspiracy theories on steroids. And it certainly, is only interested in helping civilians.
Rafi Bloom, thank you. After the break. In response to tonight's Israeli Eurovision Song Contest final on BBC, hip-hop artist and activist Lowkey performs his song Long Live Palestine Part 3, featuring Ken Loach and Frankie Boyle. All this and more coming up in Part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. Well, no party leader at this week's UK Prime Minister's Questions thought to raise the fact it was taking place on so-called Nakba Day, or the Day of Catastrophe for Palestinians. But Theresa May did find time to issue this warning to Iran after its arrest of an alleged UK spy at the British Council in Tehran.
Sadly, the arrest of this individual shows that Iran's attitude towards entirely legitimate organisations which are trying to foster better relations and cultural understanding between countries. But this is an issue that the government, as she has noted, the Foreign Secretary will take up.
What does she mean, and why does she arguably seem nervous? Could it be that she is privy as to why the US began evacuating diplomats that day ahead of the USS Abraham Lincoln and amphibious warship USS Arlington reaching Iran's shores? Certainly Eurovision was not mentioned at PMQs. Perhaps, as the BBC told this programme, and contradicting our Israeli guests in Part 1, Eurovision taking place in Israel is not a political event. Joining me now is hip-hop artist and activist Lowkey. Thank you so much for coming back on. So we heard from the former mayor of an occupied West Bank town, Northwest Friends of Israel. Both appear to say, the likes of you, Roger Waters, Wolf Alice, who knows, Lord, Lana Del Rey, Elvis Costello, all of them, you're all anti-Semites.
Well, the question has to be asked in this situation. If Jimmy Carter comes out and says Israel is presently an apartheid state, if Archbishop Desmond Tutu comes out and says he supports BDS and that it was a really vital part of the emancipation of people in South Africa. If Nelson Mandela, of all people, came out and said that their freedom was incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. Is anyone seriously suggesting that Jimmy Carter is an anti-Semite? Is anyone seriously suggesting that Desmond Tutu is an anti-Semite? I think that's quite a ridiculous farce, to be honest with you.
Okay, well, you deal with the anti-Semitism charge. What about the fact that Eurovision is a celebration of music? It's not political. Madonna and Graham Norton say it's apolitical. Obviously, the BBC does, and albeit that, of course, it does validate Israel, but it's apolitical.
Well, I mean, the fact is this. The Eurovision is taking place at the exact time marking the anniversary of the Nakba. Preceding the Nakba, there were thousands of Palestinians driven from their homes by Zionist gangs. On the Nakba, 750,000 Palestinians were dispersed to other places and displaced from their land. For the Eurovision to take place at this time, it is an attempt to normalize Israel as, you know, interestingly, being an extension of European colonialism, but normalize it as part of a happy general atmosphere that somehow people can take as something normal. Let's be clear, Israel is an exceptional state. And what do I mean by that? It's not exceptional because we concentrate on it and focus on it as part of BDS. It's exceptional because no other state violates as many UN resolutions and is sanction-proof. How is it possible that a state that continually targets civilians in violation of Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention, the amendment to the Geneva Convention, how is it possible that they deny Palestinians the right under Article 11 of UN Resolution 194 to return home? How is it possible that the illegal siege of Gaza, which has kept 2 million people imprisoned, blocked off from many different, really at the whim of the Israeli government, being blocked off from medical supplies and from food and whatnot when Israel wants to, in a frictionless occupation? How is it possible that you can have the amount of violations of international law that have taken place clearly and have been documented by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International? We're not talking about radical voices here. Somehow Israel is sanction-proof. It is for that reason that we engage with BDS, because we have seen on advice from people in South Africa that it was an essential part of it. Were it not for the Musicians Union here in the 60s being the first trade grouping to call for a boycott and not allow its members to go and perform in South Africa, were it not for the Specials in 1984 making the song Free Nelson Mandela at a time when even holding Nelson Mandela's picture in public was deemed to be illegal, at a time when Margaret Thatcher was calling the ANC terrorists, at a time when David Cameron was calling for the execution of Nelson Mandela, when Jeremy Corbyn was being arrested on the streets of London for protesting against apartheid, at a time where even you had David Cameron as late as '89 being having a paid-for trip to South Africa by an anti-sanctions lobbying firm. It put South Africa into a situation where dock workers all the way from Liverpool to Melbourne were refusing to handle South African cargo. And what I would say, to be absolutely clear, is that Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump are racist murderers. They are walking monstrosities. Now, those that stand with them today will not be judged kindly by history. As Thomas Paine said, time converts more than reason. And as we have seen precisely with apartheid South Africa, those who were either slow to pull out or those who stood with apartheid South Africa, as, let's not forget, at the same time when the Specials were making Free Nelson Mandela and Bob Dylan and Bruce Springsteen were making Sun City, you had Shimon Peres attempting to sell nuclear weapons to apartheid South Africa. At the time, it was a pariah. You even had former Prime Minister of South Africa in the 60s saying Israel is like us, an apartheid state. Now, the question is, surely at that time of boycott, divestment and sanctions movement against South African apartheid, you had people saying, well, why don't you boycott this country or why don't you boycott that country? Exactly the same logic is used to justify us not boycotting Israel at this stage. We have to be absolutely clear that music played a really integral part of that process in South Africa. And while it may not be an exact twin sibling of South African apartheid, there are commonalities and there are also differences. It's certainly a cousin.
Well, Trump and Netanyahu would deny they're racist murderers. You keep taking these parallels with apartheid South Africa. Nelson Mandela obviously believed in violence for the cause of ending apartheid. This BDS movement presumably isn't. Whereas in South Africa there was this militant wing, there's no Carlos the Jackal anymore. He's in jail. When Madonna goes and sings on Eurovision, no one is going to assassinate her, as might have happened, who knows, in the days of Sun City and artists going there. What do you think about the fact that any artist can really get away with playing in Eurovision today and nothing's really going to happen to them?
Well, I mean, Elvis Costello pulled out, Lauryn Hill pulled out. When you say get away with it, I'm not sure exactly how you mean. You mean get away from physical harm? Well, that's good. I wouldn't want anybody to be harmed.
In the sense, is it going to really harm any of these artists' careers?
Well, we can be clear that Eurovision has actually flopped. According to the head of the Israel Broadcasting Service, it is the first country in 64 years of the history of Eurovision that has failed to fund it. The government has failed to fund it itself. You know, it's relied on the broadcasting service to fund it. A huge amount of the tickets have been left unsold. There has not been a spike in tourism. Eurovision in Israel as a project has failed, and it has failed thanks to the international campaign.
Britain has close military ties with Israel under Theresa May and under Labour governments. Masses of money and weapons have been sent there. What did you make of the fact that the Grenfell cladding manufacturer, Arconic, is associated with the F-35 planes, warplanes, that may be being used in joint RAF Israeli Air Force training?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a really tragic part of this story that not only can Arconic as a company not make cladding that keeps homes safe, they also seem, the F-35 has been something that the US government has subsidized to such a massive level, but yet is still yet to show evidence that it actually works. So Arconic has participated in 2 ridiculous operations, along with Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems. They've made this F-35, and it's been sold already to many governments around the world.
OK, well, I've got to say that, I mean, the BBC, as I say, standing up for their Eurovision coverage. What do you make of the fact that the BBC, let alone many journalists, will be saying, the BBC headline recently was Gaza rocket barrage prompts Israeli strikes. What do you think goes in the minds of journalists who continually do say the problem is from Gaza, not from Israel?
Well, clearly they're arguing for violations of international law. Rocket strikes would not justify extrajudicial killings, and they would not justify the collective punishment, which is what those Israeli strikes are. Let's be clear, the 2 million people that are besieged in Gaza are besieged there illegally by the Israeli government, and trying to juxtapose events as if there hasn't been thousands of Palestinians injured over the last year, as if there hasn't been hundreds killed, as if there hadn't just in the last 24 hours before the most recent clashes, as they put it, been Palestinians killed, unarmed civilians killed at the border, at the wall by the IDF. It's almost as if there is a campaign to sweep Palestinian death out of its context and to strip people of humanity and general agency. It is almost a rule, it seems, across the media to precede reports of Israeli violence with a number of rockets from Gaza. Now, why is that happening, and why does it seem to be so commonsensical and uniform across different parts of the media? Because what it serves to do is strip this whole situation out of its context.
OK, well, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn being arrested for his defiance of apartheid and the British government's support for apartheid. What did you make of his Shadow Defence Secretary, Nia Griffith, who seems to be rowing back slightly on it, her support for Penny Mordaunt, the new Defence Secretary, saying there has to be a moratorium on war crimes? After 10 years, soldiers should be able to live a calm life and not worry about alleged war crimes. Presumably you'd think that Britain is involved in war crimes because it's working with the Israeli military.
I think she should resign, and I think Tony Blair should be prosecuted for war crimes. I do not think it should just be aimed at soldiers, obviously, but I think we should really look at our understanding of the Corbyn phenomena. His vindication by standing against the Iraq war is what has propelled him to the position he is in, and there needs to be loyalty to those that stood against the Iraq war. We are talking about the largest simultaneous mobilization of human beings in recorded history that was the demonstration against the Iraq war. I am certain that a large percentage of those people, if not all, would support the prosecuting of Tony Blair, and of course would not want soldiers to just go scot-free.
We invite Tony Blair on the program. You're going to play us out with a kind of response to Eurovision in a second.
Yes.
That's it for the show. But before we go, in response to Eurovision 2019, Lowkey will play us out with his song Long Live Palestine. You can see Lowkey performing tonight with Mike Righteous and Wolf Alice at the Not the Eurovision Party for Palestine at Favela London in Camden. We're back on Monday to talk Dr. Strangelove with the daughter of Stanley Kubrick. Until then, keep in touch with social media. See you on Monday. Here's Lowkey with Long Live.
Agency. It is almost a rule, it seems, across the media to precede reports of Israeli violence with a number of rockets from Gaza. Now, why is that happening, and why does it seem to be so commonsensical and uniform across different parts of the media? Because what it serves to do is strip this whole situation out of its context.
Okay, well, you mentioned Jeremy Corbyn being arrested for his defiance of apartheid and the British government's support for apartheid. What did you make of his Shadow Defence Secretary, Nia Griffith, who seems to be rowing back slightly on it, her support for Penny Mordaunt, the new Defence Secretary, saying there has to be a moratorium on war crimes? After 10 years, soldiers should be able to live a calm life and not worry about alleged war crimes. Presumably you'd think that Britain is involved in war crimes because it's working with the Israeli military.
I think she should resign, and I think Tony Blair should be prosecuted for war crimes. I do not think it should just be aimed at soldiers, obviously, but I think we should really look at our understanding of the Corbyn phenomena. His vindication by standing against the Iraq war is what has propelled him to the position he is in, and there needs to be loyalty to those that stood against the Iraq war. We are talking about the largest simultaneous mobilization of human beings in recorded history that was the demonstration against the Iraq war. I am certain that a large percentage of those people, if not all, would support the prosecuting of Tony Blair, and of course would not want soldiers to just go scot-free.
We invite Tony Blair on the program. You're going to play us out with a kind of response to Eurovision in a second.
Yes.
That's it for the show. But before we...
No retreat, no surrender.